All right, good afternoon, everybody. Steve Kornacki here at the big board, and now we are officially 7 days away, 1 week out, 7 days away until the 2018 midterm elections. We have been here since sometime over the summer, beginning the countdown. The number might have been triple digits back then, counting down to Election Day, but now 1 week out, here for another edition. It's daily at this point here. 218, we call this the race for the House. Which party, the Democrats or the Republicans, is going to get at least 218 seats and control of the House? We have been breaking that down. We've been breaking down the battle for the Senate. Republicans trying to hang on there. Also, governor's races around the country, and even a little bit of a sneak peek looking ahead to 2020, because guess what? As soon as all the votes are tallied for 2018, they are going to be out there and running for 2020. You can count on that. So what we've been doing on this show is we have been taking you through the latest numbers, the latest trends, the latest developments we are seeing right here at the board. And then we're talking with some of the smartest people we can find when it comes to these polls, when it comes to numbers, when it comes to analyzing all of the data that's out there, sometimes on the left, sometimes on the right, sometimes right down the middle. We're doing it every day between now and the election. And so today, well, we talk a lot about the House, the race for 218. We talk a lot about the battle for the Senate. But there is, as I mentioned just a second ago, governor's races are the other major piece of the puzzle we're going to be talking about right here at this board 1 week from tonight. You're going to have marquee races all around the country. And governor's races are important, obviously, for a couple different reasons, right? You know, number one, a lot of these key governor's races end up being in the key swing states. The key swing states from 2016, the key swing states in 2020. So it's a chance to go in and take the temperature statewide, the political temperature in some of those key battleground states. The other thing about governor's races, we know this has been true in the past, certainly, it's governor's offices, governor's mansions have produced a lot of presidents through the years. A Ronald Reagan, a Jimmy Carter, a Bill Clinton. You know, more recently, of course, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, they followed a different path. George W. Bush was a governor, too. So at least until the last decade or so, it was sort of a truism in politics that the road to the White House ran through the State House and not necessarily Congress. And so certainly from the standpoint of Democrats looking ahead to 2020, there might be some interesting potential players in that mix who are emerging because of governor's races in 2018. And then, of course, there is also this. We talk about 218 in the race for the House. Well, what has a big role when it comes to any race for the House? The actual map. How are those 435 district lines drawn around the country? How does each state choose to draw the district lines? Does it become more beneficial to one party or the other? Is it straight down the middle? Well, guess who has, in a lot of states, in most states, guess who has a lot to say about how those district lines are drawn? You got it, the governor. And so if you've got a governor's election in 2018 and you got that census in 2 years in 2020 and then the new maps being drawn off that census, it is the governors who are being elected right now, 7 days from today, who are going to have a lot to say about those new maps after this coming census. And those new maps are going to have a lot to say about the race to 218 over the next decade. So that's probably the most important reason maybe to be paying attention to these governor's races. And so we thought we would take you through, first of all, just where do some of these marquee governor's races stand right now? We've been looking at polling throughout the fall. Let's take you through some of them here. Georgia, we've talked an awful lot about this race. Certainly we will next Tuesday night. It looks like a very close one. Our poll from last week, we've got Brian Kemp, the Republican, 1 point ahead of Stacey Abrams. Remember, the wild card in Georgia, this is a runoff state. You got a Libertarian candidate here getting 4% right now. If he gets that on Election Day or something like that and keeps Abrams and Kemp from both hitting the 50% margin, then this race goes to a runoff, be held December 4th. So keep that in mind. Even if somebody wins or has the most votes on Election night, unless you're over 50%, you are not actually getting elected governor of Georgia on Election night. So that's one, obviously, we've been keeping a close eye on. Minnesota here, this has been an interesting race. This is where the Republican primary had that big upset. Tim Pawlenty, the former governor, the former presidential candidate, he ran to get his old job back. He lost the Republican primary. Tim Walz, a Democrat, won the nomination of his party. He's been leading pretty comfortably in the average of polling out there. Of course, Walz gave up that congressional seat, that House seat in southern Minnesota, a Democratic district, because he's represented it for a while, but the district voted for Trump by double digits in 2016. It's an opportunity for Republicans to pick up a Democratic House seat with Tim Walz not running in that seat this year. That's an interesting thing we'll be keeping an eye on as well come election night. Ohio, here we go. always a swing state, not as much in 2016, but right back to that status right now. Cordray, the Democrat, leading DeWine, although this is there are not as many polls out here maybe as we thought we would get, but if you average them all together over the last few months, Cordray has had a slight edge in that race. Pennsylvania, this one not looking close at all. Pennsylvania, one of those states that put Trump over the top in 2016. State no Republican had won presidentially since '88. Trump won it in 2016. 2 years later, the Democratic incumbent governor looks like he is coasting to re-election out there. In interesting development, Wisconsin, Democrats taking another shot at Scott Walker. He won in 2010. He survived the recall in 2012. He got re-elected in 2014. But now, Tony Evers, the Democrat, he has been leading if you average the polls together out there. Florida as well. This one is interesting because you had those two political bases, the Republican base, the Democratic base in the primaries. You had turnout through the roof on both sides, and it was shaping up as this sort of test of the bases, although we have to say the polling we've been seeing in the general election out here has consistently had Andrew Gillum, the Democrat, ahead. Generally not by a wide margin. Gillum certainly within striking distance, but poll after poll after poll in this race has shown Gillum ahead by a couple points, so he does seem to have the advantage, at least according to the polls, at least a week out from Election Day. Of course, it is still a week out. Things can change. We've seen that happen once or twice in the past. But we thought we would break down some of these governor's races, what they mean for 2020, what they mean for redistricting potentially, with someone who follows this stuff very closely. He is Stephen Shepard. He's a reporter and chief polling analyst for Politico, and he joins us now. And Stephen, thank you for taking a few minutes. And you actually wrote an article about some of these races and the impact on redistricting. You said the 5 governor's races that could change Washington for the next decade. I think it's pretty much the 5 we just went through right there, minus Florida. Take us through, from that redistricting standpoint we were talking about, take us through what you're seeing in these races.
Sure, there are a number of states where the governor plays a key role, whether he has veto power, whether he or she can appoint members to a redistricting commission that will handle the line drawing. These are places where Democrats, in many cases, have been behind the 8 ball for most of this decade because of maps that were drawn by Republican legislatures and Republican governors that were elected following the 2010 Republican wave. And so in almost all of these states, minus New Hampshire and Vermont, that are electing governors this year, this governor is definitely going to be in place, barring any kind of resignation, when the next time we draw the maps following the 2020 census. And so it is incumbent for Democrats, and you hear them talk about this all the time. The reason to win this year and not to think too much down the road about 2020 is to get these folks in place to play these key state constitutional roles when it comes to redrawing the maps next year.
Yeah, so I'm curious, just in the situation we're looking at now in terms of battle for the House, Democrats needing a net gain of 23. There's been all this talk this year. Do the Democrats need to win the popular vote nationally? Is it 7 points? Is it only 5? Is it maybe as high as 11? These numbers have been all over the place. But basically, the suggestion is that because of gerrymandering in a lot of ways, because of the ways these lines are drawn right now, the Democrats need to do extra well on Election Day. Do you have a sense how to quantify what advantage Republicans on the current map get from the way the lines are drawn?
Well, I think at the beginning of the cycle, it started pretty close to 10 points. It's not just gerrymandering, of course. There are districts, urban districts, with tight concentrations of population where Democrats routinely run up 90 or 95% of the vote. Republicans don't have districts like that. Their population is much more efficiently distributed to win in more places. That said, gerrymandering does play a big part of this. What I think started at about a 10-point advantage is probably closer to 5 now, and there are a couple of different factors. One, Pennsylvania. That congressional map was redrawn earlier this year by the state Supreme Court, which found that it was the old map was a Republican gerrymander that was so kind of drawn to their advantage that it violated the state constitution. And they drew a map where Democrats now can pick up 4, 5, maybe even as many as 6 seats, in large part because of the new district lines. The other factor, I think, is those Republican retirements. Republican incumbents have an edge in some of these districts going back for a decade now, where you would think, you look at the presidential vote or you look at the vote for other offices and you would think they would be more competitive, but incumbents do have an advantage. There's a reason so few of them usually lose in these House elections. They can raise money more easily. They have name ID built in that their challengers have to earn. Those advantages have been whittled away as more than 40 Republican incumbents have decided not to seek re-election. So I think those two factors have kind of moved that goalpost from what I had as maybe closer to 10 to closer to 5 now as we approach Election Day.
And you raise an interesting point there, too, is this issue of gerrymandering versus just population distribution. Because when you start looking at, it's amazing to go back a generation or two and look at Democrats in presidential races and where they could win on the map nationally versus where they win now. And it's so tightly bunched in these metro areas, cities, the immediate outside of cities. I mean, even if Democrats get control of these various state houses for 2020, are there limits on what they could do in terms of drawing the lines just because of what you're saying about population distribution?
I think that's a big part of it. As long as you're going to have urban centers where Democrats win 90% of the vote, it's going to be impossible to crack them to such a degree without running afoul of the same sort of principles that, and in some cases laws that we're talking about with what Republicans did following 2010. The other factor here that I think is going to limit the ability of some of these, if there are a bunch of new Democratic governors next year, as we move post-2020 into the new reapportionment and redistricting in 2021, is a number of these states have ballot measures this year that are going to tweak or in some cases change pretty radically the political input that governors and legislators will have in redrawing these lines. Colorado, Michigan, there are redistricting referenda on the ballot in a number of states this year. And this is something, reformers have been pushing this for a long time. And this is something that's pretty popular. You talk to the average American a decade ago, I'm not sure if folks knew what gerrymandering was, but they hear about it a lot more now. And I think these initiatives, anytime I've seen polling on them, they're pretty popular. And so if a number of them pass next week, we could be looking at a decreased role for both parties when it comes to the political calculus that goes into redistricting in 2021.
I guess another question, looking at some of those polls we just put up in these governor's races, Pennsylvania comes to mind right away, the Democrat running away with the race there. Minnesota, even if Tim Walz really is ahead by, around 10 points or so in that race. I'm thinking of Illinois, too. We didn't have it up there, but the Democrat way ahead in Illinois. Is there a chance, do you see, for sort of a down ballot effect there where Democrats have those targeted congressional races in those different states, and where is there some benefit to the Democratic candidates in those congressional races if at the top of the ticket the Democratic candidate for governor is putting up a big margin, or are those just totally separate, federal and state, in people's minds?
I think voters are more willing to cross party lines when it comes to state elections, like for governor. The one thing I will say, though, is if your Republican governor or Republican gubernatorial nominee, say Governor Bruce Browner in Illinois or Jeff Johnson in Minnesota, or Bill Schuette maybe in Michigan, is way behind, that may decrease the reason for a lot of these Republican voters to come out. And so if you're in Illinois and you're, say, Rodney Davis in the 13th district, or Randy Holtgren in the 14th district, or even Pete Roskam, who we've been talking about for a long time, in the 6th district, if you're Congressman Jason Lewis or Eric Paulson in the Twin Cities suburbs, if you're Fred Upton even in Michigan, or Mike Bishop, or in the 11th district, an open seat, Republicans there may see a little bit of a drag because they're getting blown out at the top of the ticket. I think that's something that Republicans are worried about, and Democrats are on the offense. They've been going after Fred Upton now for about a week on the airwaves. That's not a district that had been really on anybody's radar going in, at least until the final couple of weeks of the campaign. I'm
curious, too, just in terms of longer-term implications, take the Georgia and Florida races in particular, because the Democrats there, it seems like you have two candidates who emerged with very high energy from the Democratic voters in the primaries, and taking sort of a strategic approach that Democrats in both of those states have not typically taken in the past, where in the past the idea has been to try to find somebody who's going to run to the middle, going to try to find that sort of, stereotypical Republican-friendly voter who's willing to vote Democratic under certain circumstances. It looks like with Gillum and Abrams, Democrats made a very different calculation in both of those states. And I'm looking at those polls and I'm saying Gillum certainly has a decent chance of winning. Abrams might even be able to pull it off in Georgia. If they're both able to win, or even if one of them is able to win, is that going to have a ripple effect, do you think, in terms of the calculations Democrats make nationally in 2020?
I think it's certainly going to be a big argument for that. Now, remember, in both states, Republicans made the same calculation. In Florida, they nominated Ron DeSantis. He was over Adam Putnam. He was Trump's pick. He ran to the right of Putnam in that race. In Georgia, they nominated Brian Kemp over Casey Cagle, the lieutenant governor. Again, Kemp ran to the right, especially on cultural issues in that race. So you have elections that are taking place as sort of with both parties focused on base turnout. To me, the more obviously Gillum is a super interesting test case here for that strategy in the nation's largest and swingiest swing state. In Georgia, I think this one is almost more interesting because Stacey Abrams, from the start of her candidacy in the primary, talked about bringing out people to vote, particularly African-American voters in rural areas who don't turn out at high rates at all, and getting them not only to turn out for an election, but to get them to turn out for a midterm election. She's done a lot of work, even before her candidacy, on voter registration in those parts of the state, and I think a lot of Democrats will be looking at not just the result, but where the votes are coming from and what kind of margin she's running up in some of those majority black counties in sort of southwestern Georgia, to see the efficacy of this strategy and whether or not they want to nominate candidates in 2020 who can appeal to the same kind of voters.
That's a good point, too. Just, of course, the Republican base is sort of making the same calculation in this area as the Democratic base, and you've got both parties moving in those directions. Just changing gears, though, because we have you here and you follow the House as closely as anybody out there. I'm just curious, a week out, it seems to me there's a range of possibilities here where you could create a scenario where Republicans keep the House by, let's say, 5 seats, and you could look at the same races and say, hey, the Democrats, this might break, and the Democrats, have a 40-seat wave. Where are your expectations on that sort of range of possibilities right now?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that's been interesting to me is that as we've gotten closer to Election Day, the battlefield seems to be getting larger, not smaller. Usually you see parties say, well, we only have a limited amount of resources in the final days of the campaign. We're going to focus on the most competitive races, or the races that we think we have the best chance to win and our money can be sort of the most valuable. We're seeing the map get bigger just on Monday, and I think not just get bigger, but get bigger with bringing more Republican targets on the board. Just on Monday, the National Republican Congressional Committee investing in television advertising in South Carolina's 1st District. This, to me, is a great example of this. That's the district where Mark Sanford lost a primary earlier this year. Democrats haven't held it. I think you have to go back to the late 70s since they held that sort of coastal South Carolina district. It was last competitive a decade ago. Maybe your savvier viewers will remember the name Linda Kettner, who was the Democratic candidate against Henry Brown in 2008. She still fell short. This is a place where if this is competitive on Election Day, it's difficult to see Republicans having a good shot to keep the House. At the same time, all those races that are far more Democratic than this one, when you look at the polling, they're still within the margin of error. You have essentially a battlefield of 50 to 60 races right now where you could see them all, if most of them went in one direction, Republicans narrowly keeping the House. That said, when the battlefield gets bigger, to me, that's a tell that Republicans' chances are getting a little bit smaller. Yeah,
that's interesting. Although I have it in my head, too. It's just if it goes 2 points this way, the result is resounding for the Democrats. If it goes 2 points that way, maybe it's that the Republicans, it's almost like Trump in 2016, just the right combination lines up and they can just barely keep it. But yeah, 7 days out, we've got a suspenseful race for the House in a way we haven't for a while. Stephen Shepard from Politico, thank you for taking a few minutes with us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Steve.
All right, and thank you for watching at home. And again, here we are, folks. It is the final week, 7 days from today. We're back at it again tomorrow, continuing that countdown to Election Day. We will see you all right back here, noon Eastern tomorrow.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.